Hi, everyone, and welcome. I'm Maddie Buris, one of Custora's marketing managers, and I'm very excited to be here today with JC Goodrich, Custora's VP of Marketing, and Andy Lim, Custora's Head of Data Science. Thanks so much for joining our webinar today about building data-driven personas. These webinars are a part of our effort to bring together a community of e-commerce marketers, and we try to make them as much as possible about you. So we'd love to hear from you during the session. If you have any questions, please chat them in the GoToWebinar window, and we'll leave about 15 minutes at the end of the webinar to get to your questions. If we don't, we will also follow up with you via email afterwards. So Andy and JC will present for about 40 minutes, and then we'll leave the rest of the time for your questions. After the webinar is over, we will also, as always, email you the deck and the recording. And we'll also ask you for some quick feedback, which always helps us improve these webinars. So again, very happy to have everyone on today. Please chat us any questions. And with that, I'm going to hand it over. This is a beautiful picture of JC and Andy. And now we'll get started. JC, take it away.
Hi, everyone. As Manny said, thanks again for joining. We hope to have a really informative 45 minutes to an hour here. I want to start with just a quick overview of Custora, just so you know whose webinar you are on. So Custora powers customer-obsessed commerce. We are a customer intelligence platform that works with retailers. We work with around 100 brands. Some of the biggest names in retail, including 7 of the top 20, process a ton of transactions, and we've been doing this for about 7 years now. Been through a lot in terms of working with companies and helping them think through their use cases. Personas is obviously a big one of those use cases. So we're excited to share some of our learnings over the last several years in the next hour or so. In terms of agenda, so we'll hit on a few topics again, as Manny said, half hour or so, and then we'll jump to questions. We'll spend a little bit of time just going over Personas 101, just what is a persona, why do I need it, why is it helpful? Then Andy's going to jump into a bit more detail around like how personas are built, specifically in the context of what we call data-driven or observed purchase history personas. And then we'll spend a little bit of time talking about common challenges and questions that we've seen. But I would encourage you kind of as we're going here to drop us a line, and I'll make sure to hit on any questions that are asked of the group from the group at that point. Cool. Let's take a poll. Go ahead.
Yeah, so we're going to start out with a poll, which we like to do at the beginning of most webinars to get everyone involved, get you warmed up. So the question is, I'm going to launch this poll in 1 second. My company currently uses personas in our marketing efforts, and the options are true, false, we're working on it, or other. So I'm just going to wait for a minute or so to give everyone a chance to respond. And then we will check out the answers. All right. Looks like we're almost there in terms of participation. All right, gonna go ahead and close the poll. All right, so.
Cool, so it looks like we have about half the group is using personas in some form, and we'll talk about that in a second in terms of how to think about different types of personas. About 15% not, and the rest, about 40%, working on it. So cool. Well, I think our goal, that's super helpful. Thanks for filling that out. We're gonna spend some time. We'll start with some of the basics, and for those of you who are using personas, that might be a bit of a review. But we'll quickly get into some of the more detailed stuff around building them, and then, like I said, hit on some of the challenges. So hopefully it should be useful for everyone.
Didn't need to put that back up.
That's okay.
There we go.
We're back. Cool. Okay, so let's spend a few minutes just talking through some of the basics around personas. So what is a persona? Like what is an actual persona at a high level? It's a representation of a segment of buyers based on data reflecting behaviors, attitudes, or characteristics. We'll talk about this in a second, but essentially a persona is like an abstraction of a group out of a population as a whole, right? They can be used in a variety of different ways. Sorry. Oh. Okay, so why use personas? The first and the overarching reason is to better understand your customers. We'll talk about some of those specific use cases in a second. The second reason is to create more relevant marketing. So personas are typically used to help companies simplify their messaging and the variations of their messaging in order to create more relevant messages for specific groups of customers. And we'll talk about which personas can be best used in that situation, but it's a very common use of personas. The third reason is to make better merchandising decisions. So, obviously if you're better understanding your customers based on these groups, you can better create products and services to meet those preferences. Again, it depends on what type of persona you're using, which we'll talk about in a second. But that is yet another use of personas. And then finally, to drive more revenue. So let's talk a little bit about how to build personas. Mr. Andy, do you want to take it away? Oh, why don't I chat about this? Yeah. Andy, say hi.
Oh, hi, yeah. I'm Andy. Just to introduce myself, I've been silent here so far, but I'm head of data science here at Custora. I guess I normally spend most of my day in the ones and zeros, as it were, but Maddie invited me on out here to this very comfy, well-furnished studio to record this webinar. So here I am, and I'm excited and hopeful that we can share some interesting insights about personas.
Cool. So let's first talk just a little bit about personas. Is a very broad term and can be used for a lot of different things, as we just talked about. Let's talk about the different ways personas are made, right? So the first one is kind of like a gut feel, and that is in quotes, not because we are anti doing things on gut feel, but that is just a term people often use to describe how they're thinking about their customers. Typically, this type of persona is created in a more creative sense, right? So, and it makes sense, right? Because if every creative product was built based on some amalgamation of past purchase behavior, we wouldn't have very many innovative products in the world. So, this is a very valid and reasonable way to make personas. Typically, it's based on, I'm overly abstracting here, but some form of psychographic understanding of a particular trend or a particular, sort of attitudinal feeling that a group of people take on. But again, generally used in more sort of creative avenues. The second area is around demographic data. This is typically in a mass advertising context, or in a situation where you might not have specific customer level data, but you might have good sort of overall abstractions of customer data, like age, location, where they're from, are they rural, are they urban? These are, again, useful segments when you either don't have the data or you're trying to draw some massive generalization. But in the context of things that are used for actioning like marketing or building products, can be sometimes very general and sometimes very generalized, I guess is the right way to put it. And now we'll get into some of the more granular forms of personas. The first is around stated preferences. So many companies build clusters of customers or non-customers based on stated attitudes, right? So this is a car company would build personas based on customers that state that they reject the status quo, for example. Oftentimes in mass advertising or again, like where you're trying to sort of tap into a more emotional vein within a group of customers or non-customers, state preferences can be helpful. And then the final form of personas, which is what we're going to be talking about in more detail today, are around observed preferences, aka actual buying behavior. As the name implies, these types of personas are based on not so much the way people feel or the way they think, but what they've actually done and what we've actually observed of their behaviors. For us, in the context of retail, this generally means we've seen their purchase history, and we can somehow group their purchase history by a series of attributes, and then conduct the analysis to create the actual personas. So with that, why don't I turn it over to Andy to go through kind of how we create these personas and the data we use to do so.
Yeah, great. Thanks, JC. I guess on the next few slides after this, I'm going to talk a little bit about the modeling approach that we take here at Custora. First, what I kind of wanted to do is draw the distinction between, say, the data that you're fitting your personas to and the sort of underlying mathematics or mechanics of how the model works. You can fit personas, as JC discussed, on a variety of different kinds of data sets. And it's not, I would say it's not necessarily the case that like one of those data sets is like right or wrong to fit personas to. The real question is like, what kinds of insights are you interested in drawing out of your customer data set or whatever set of data you're analyzing? In our case, in Custora's case, we were specifically interested in presenting personas as, I guess, purchasing patterns that we observe in customer data. So we were interested in sort of eliciting from the raw customer data, like what kinds of patterns people like to buy. And I'll go into that in a bit more in the next slides. For trying to figure out what kinds of purchasing patterns exist in the data, we think it makes the most sense to actually look at the data, given that we have it. I think there's no more straightforward way to figure out patterns in what kinds of purchaser types you have than to look at what people are actually purchasing. That's like this kind of data we pick to build our persona models on. The choice of model is not totally independent of your choice of data. Like, depending on what kinds of data you're analyzing, you may choose one model or the other. The persona models, which I'll get to shortly, are oriented around modeling personas or fitting personas based on count of data. This is the next. There we go, cool. And count of data is relevant here because what we do is we look at each customer's, the number of orders each customer has placed of a given type. So, in the simple example, we were doing like clothing, and we've, imagined that there are 4 types of orders: shirts, pants, shoes, and hats. In our models, a single persona is a weighted spin over order item. So what I mean by weighted spin is like kind of like a spinner you imagine from like a board game or something like that. And when I say weighted spin, I mean that like the wedges are sort of different sizes. So maybe in this example, you see a persona who has a broad tendency to purchase, a little bit from each category, but more from shirts and pants and shoes, and a little bit from hats. So that's sort of what personas mean under our model. And what we say is that each customer's purchases, according to these model assumptions, are generated from sort of a spin of the spinner. Each customer's order is randomly of one of these, say, 4 types that are in the data. This customer, if they tend to buy more shirts and pants and shoes than hats, might be well described by the spinner you see on this slide. This on the left, you might, this is an example of some empirical data that, might be well described by this single persona. So if you're in your actual data, you have, say, like this many units sold of, these different 4 order item types, then, a reasonable single persona, if you were trying to use a single persona to describe the whole customer base, would be simply a persona whose wedges are weighted in proportion to the actual orders you see in the data. However, it may be the case that if you were to, here I'll toggle back just once and then forth, you can see the graph on the left. Imagine that looking at the graph on the left, you could actually, it wasn't really the case that like every customer was equally likely to buy, shirts, or likely to buy shirts and pants and shoes and hats in these proportions. But instead, if there were kind of like two distinct underlying patterns we saw in the data, where certain customers, really tended to buy shirts and pants, and some customers really tended to buy shoes. And it just, it happens that when you add up the, everything all together, you get the distribution in the previous slide. But, in an example like this, you would say that like, yeah, maybe my customer base isn't best described by a single persona. Maybe it's best described by these two personas, one that's primarily shirts and pants and one that's primarily shoes. And so what you can imagine is these two different sort of spinners sort of representing different purchasing patterns, in the sense that like the people who tend to buy shoes a lot draw from the spinner that is weighted most heavily towards shoes.
Makes sense?
Cool. And yeah, what we do is actually I guess I've skipped over this a little bit here, but we actually divide customers into 5 personas, and what we do in the Custora app is assign a probability that each customer belongs to each of those 5 personas. So under the hood, not directly visible in the app, but under the hood, each customer in each of our customers' data sets gets a set of 5 probabilities that sum to 1 that assigns them to each of the 5 personas we have. And then as far as segmentation goes, what we do is if we think that the customer is weighted at least 50% towards a persona, we put them into a segment for that persona. Otherwise, we kind of make our best guess. Assign the customer to whichever persona they lean to the most heavily. So.
Okay, cool. Thank you, Andy. Just one note on the previous slide before we get into the FAQs. In terms of like the reason you need to assign users to personas, can you talk a little bit about like the extremes, like why we need to put a user into a segment based on some sort of probability?
Mm-hmm. Yeah, sure. I would say that so there are, like this is let's see how to put it. This is an example of a model that first computes a probability between 0 and 1, and then assigns them based on that. There are other models that just strictly place personas into one persona or the other, if that's what you mean. I think that the former type of model can be turned into the latter by doing some kind of thresholding, which is what we're doing here. And so with a model that does actually sort of recognize gradations between how strong data points or customers' membership is to one persona versus the other, such a model can do everything that like the sort of hard assigning model can do, and in fact offer some flexibility, because in the future, if we think that it's appropriate to change the thresholds, or we want to take sort of more fine-grained action based on the actual probability number, then that's something that is open to us in the model in a way that wouldn't be open to us in a model that just assigned users to one persona or the other.
Got it. Just one other point to add to that, if you did not do this, meaning if you were trying to figure out exactly what persona any random user fit into, you would just end up with a lot of personas. And it would sort of defeat the purpose of having personas to begin with. Mm-hmm. So you need some sort of mechanism or some sort of threshold to make this kind of operationally feasible. You're trying to execute on.
So you're asking about like the number of personas selection? Yeah. So yeah, I guess I suppose I did the one persona, the 2 persona example. Yeah, there is a question, and I think we will touch on that a bit more in some subsequent slides. But like maybe to set the bounds of the problem, in that single one persona example I gave, you could a one persona model kind of almost isn't really a persona, so to speak, persona model, so to speak. Yeah, here we go. We have fun. questions.
That's what a good host does. They lead into the
Oh,
next
okay,
question.
yeah.
Or
So,
they maybe just confuse them.
well, yeah, I fell into your trap. If you imagine like a one persona model, which I kind of discussed earlier, you can almost say that's not really a persona model. All you're doing is like looking at averages and then just producing that. On the other extreme, you could create like a model that has a persona for every user. Like you have 1 million customers, fine, 1 million personas. And you could make that fit the observed data very well, in the sense that like you could create that person, each persona would get completely custom tailored to every user. But it would be, it would be overfitted. It wouldn't tell you anything useful. Like, looking at 1 million personas doesn't really give you anything, any extra insight, doesn't really give you any good actions you can take, anything like that. So really what you want is some sort of balance that maybe takes the entirety of the, the data, the entirety of the customer base, and divides it into a sort of graspable, workable with number of personas. Yeah, I guess on this slide we've discussed, just some of the challenges, the operational challenges that do come up with personas. Like if you have too few personas, sort of fewer personas than like are actually realized by the data set, you might try to squish multiple buyer patterns into one. In the extreme example, if you have only one persona, you're basically squashing everyone into sort of one single like buying pattern. If you have too many personas, it's difficult to work with. You might have a couple personas that are really like not very relevant. And in that extreme like 1 million persona example, like what are you going to do with a persona, any given persona? Really nothing. So yeah, really in terms of like figuring out what the right number of personas is, what you want to do is strike some balance between what's graspable and what's usable. We've in the Custora app, we've gone with 5. The model itself can do different numbers, but there are a lot of, I guess, some operational challenges behind allowing that to vary. Like one example. I guess we could talk about the supervised.
Sure. Yeah. Well, actually, before we jump to that, the only thing I would add to the personas do I need, and we encounter this a lot. Mm-hmm. Once the sort of the models make it out into the wild and they're being put in practice, on some level, the number of personas you have is like the variance of marketing you need to produce, right? And so having like 10, 15, 20 different versions of your creative, spreading out that work over the same number of people, it not only is it like probably not useful from the perspective of like you might start kind of overfitting your model, but also it's just like really hard to execute in practice. And a lot of those personas might start looking the same. So that is why, part of the reason why like we landed on the handful of personas that we typically build. Mm-hmm. Yeah, that's a great point.
If retailers weren't using Custora and were trying to figure out or determine how many personas to build, what are some questions or constraints they might think about?
So I guess the question of like, let's see, questions and constraints. I would like, when you say constraints, I tend to think of that more like what kind of data do I have available, which is certainly like always a challenge.
One thing I'm thinking about specifically, because I work in marketing too, though on the B2B side, is creative. Like say I have all these personas, but it's just not possible with the team size that I have to create emails or to create display ads for that number of personas. Mm-hmm. So that's one I think of, mm-hmm. And I feel like anything larger than probably 10 seems just not doable.
Yeah, there's certainly the operational challenge with personas. Really, with any models, that's where I guess Custora, maybe like the technical side of Custora interacts with, say, like the business end of Custora. We're trying to not just make sure that what we produce, not just produce statistical insights for the sake of producing statistical insights, but hopefully provide in the form of the app like some useful, actionable thing to do with them, mm-hmm. Or at least a useful presentation of them, so that our customers can take that information and then do with it what they see fit. So yeah, there's certainly an operational challenge in trying to like take action on like a very, very large number of personas. And yeah, I guess if in terms of like trying to figure out like what a good number is in a vacuum, like what you there are sort of like these meta-analyses you can do where this comes a bit into like where, data science is a little bit more of an art than a science. You take the data and you try fitting models at different numbers of personas, and you kind of see like how much variation in the data you explain with the model. And every incremental persona will explain more of the variation. In the extreme case, you can overfit and explain the data excellently by producing like tons and tons of personas. And so you come up with some decisions, some trade-off about like, well, I feel that this incremental component that I'm using doesn't sort of explain enough data for the complexity that it represents, the added complexity. And yeah, that's a judgment call. I do think sometimes people don't realize it, but like data science doesn't, I guess, take away the sort of human decision elements of many things. Like it's not the case that like there's always just a right answer and you just solve for X. What it does is allow you to more precisely quantify data on which to make those human decisions.
Yeah, I think one other point on that is, again, going back to what we were talking about at the beginning, it depends on what you're trying to accomplish, right? So like an attitudinal segmentation or set of personas or cluster analysis, you can omit certain variables that don't matter. You could have like variance that isn't material to your to the argument you're trying to make or to the thing you're trying to solve for. So that's again where the art comes into it, when you're sort of omitting variables or describing using additional variables to sort of tell the story you want to tell, or to find a story that is logical to tell. Cool. Do we want to talk about, there was a point around supervised versus unsupervised?
Yeah.
Anyone on that? Yeah.
Yeah, this is maybe an important thing to touch on because I think this comes up a lot in data science in other contexts as well, but I think it's an important thing to sort of grasp and appreciate. There are, a common way of classifying models is between supervised and unsupervised models. And supervised models are more along the lines of, I want to predict this concrete thing, predict it for me, and then your predictions are in fact falsifiable, I'll say, in the sense that you can breathe. Yeah, they're like the predictions are falsifiable in some sense, in that you can sort of like hold out data and then see how those predictions did on the held out data, and then assess the quality of your model according to various error metrics. An unsupervised model is less about being told to find a specific thing and more about saying, here is a bunch of data, model, find me patterns in this data. I don't necessarily know what patterns exist already in this data. I would like you to find interesting insights and patterns. And there's a little less falsifiability in this sense that like you can come up with a few different patterns, and according to different criteria, maybe one is quote unquote better than the other, but ultimately you don't have like a concrete thing you want predicted. You're just interested in finding patterns. Many of the models in Custora are supervised, like say like CLV prediction. The persona model is unsupervised. What you're doing is saying, here's the order item data model, find me some personas in this that explain variation in this data. And so, I think this is an important thing to touch on because, it does maybe, does touch on like some of the challenges, which I think the next slide will actually cover with personas. Like one of the big ones is just, personas reflect, can and will change over time, right? It's not like, targeting users with CLV over this, $100 or $200 or what have you. That is sort of a distinct, well-defined thing, like CLV greater than 100, and maybe the model refits over time, and new customers get added, and the customer mix changes, but the criteria for targeting that segment doesn't sort of definitionally change. Whereas if you're saying like, act on these personas, what can happen is over time, the product mix itself changes, resulting in sort of like different personas emerging from the data. And just dealing with that is an operational challenge that I would say that we're continuing to work on. But that's sort of one of the things that can happen when you're sort of like acting on the outcome of an unsupervised model as opposed to a supervised model. So
Yeah, the world can change as well. Like your product mix can change, but like preferences can change, like future does not always break the past. This is why sometimes gut feel can be like a very effective way to make a persona.
Yeah, I'm like I'm a Bayesian at heart, so I don't like.
Explain what that means for the non.
Oh yeah,
data
like I'd say like you enter your data analysis with sort of prior opinions, and what data does is allow you to revise those opinions in the face of observed data. But I think when people sometimes first learn about the idea of Bayesian analysis, they say like, oh, like having a prior opinion, like where does that come from, all that stuff. But the more you think about it, the more sense it makes. Like really, opinions do come from somewhere, and they get revised to something new. So.
Let's talk a little bit more about why building personas is hard, and not just challenging for people who are trying to do it without a software like Custora, but even at Custora, like what makes this hard? We can talk about these three challenges.
Yeah, I think I touched a little bit on I'd say like issues number 1 and 3 are fairly related. Just like you have an unsupervised model, what you're telling it is just like, hey, look at this data and go like find me personas. In fact, the reason why we fixed the number of personas, one of the other reasons aside from what JC touched on, is that there are just operational challenges. If you allow that to vary and try to run the sort of meta-analysis, what can happen is that due to relatively small changes in the data, maybe the number of personas that it comes up with varies a little bit, but that produces some real operational challenges for people when sort of like, when we recalibrate the model every now and then, we see like a totally changed number of personas, or what used to be 2 get now fused into 1 or something like that. So that's a real operational challenge, and that is an argument in favor of fixing the number of personas, just again, so that we're not just creating statistical insight for the sake of it, but providing something that people can act on. Other than that, a lot of the operational challenges, I think we've talked about this before, but just really implementing stuff is a challenge. It's like sort of an almost like a trite phrase at this point that like in tech or in startup worlds, like ideas aren't worth anything. Maybe ideas are a multiplier of implementation. That's no less true in data science. Like it's not the case that like, oh, like you have the idea of the model here and now that's like everything. Even if you take the mathematical papers that or mathematical papers or textbooks and study them for a bit, well, that certainly gets you farther, but that doesn't give you anything. That doesn't give you everything rather. A lot of the challenges in actually implementing code that fits the model and does so reliably, doing small engineering efficiencies here or there to like speed up the process, dealing with the potential for very large data, and also dealing with things that I'd say the Custora app as a whole tries to do, which is ingesting customer data week after week, making sure it's in some standardized schema, some standardized form that the model can operate with, and sort of like, so operationally knowing what to do, how often to refit the model, like how to deal with sort of certain categories like appearing in the data set or dropping out of the data set, things like that. That's actually quite a bit of work, and I would say that that's, when we talk about operational challenges, I think there is a temptation to look at the math, the modeling, the data science, and say like, oh, that's everything, and that's definitely not everything.
Could you talk a little bit about the typical process you use to like clean data?
I would say that's going a bit outside of my orbit, but basically for persona data, the data we fit on for personas and all of our other models, we sort of have like 2 steps. So like if you can imagine the data resides first of all in the customer's databases somewhere. And we set up a process with them during onboarding where either they push their data to us, often they upload data to an FTP, or we pull data from them through an integration of some sort. Maybe they give us credentials to query a database on their end. So there's a whole chunk of the Custora app devoted to the possible different data sets that are, and methods for integration that customers have, and trying to get that from that, trying to get the data from there into our databases, in which we have like some standardization of schema, just some sense of like, what customers orders, orders of order items, like what are the different attributes associated with them. And that's, that I would say encompasses like just all sorts of data. It's not specific to personas. The order item data that the persona model uses is the same that, say, however, some of the sort of factual segmentation in Segment Builder in Custora, when you want to select like users whose most common order item was shoes. If we imagine that previous slide with the shoes heavy persona, there would probably be a high correlation between that and customers in the shoes persona.
But just in terms of, there are like many things that if someone is, someone listening to this is doing this, let's like obviously without Custora, there's a lot of details that go into that, what you just said, right? So there's like outliers in the data need to get removed, right? Errors, obviously, that always creep in. There's coding of product attributes so that you can actually create clusters, right? Like if you were to run a persona on like or if you were to build personas on like item level inputs, it would be like you need something that codes those item level inputs as shoes. Right? Yeah. Like the model doesn't know that like XYZ 9000 is like a shoe, right? You have to actually go through and create that mapping prior to building this persona, right?
That's right, and in the integration step, different customers have this data stored in different ways, and so like making sure we get all their data into our standardized schemas is a major challenge, and some of the things that our tech team works on a lot.
Got it. Yeah.
Cool. So we have some good questions coming in right now, which I want to get to, and one of them is actually on the following slide, the answer to it. So the question is, can we have some real world examples of how some of your customers are using personas? So we put in one example from Tiffany & Co. And you did say it can be anonymous, and often we do use anonymous examples, so you don't want to give away too much of our customer's secret sauce. But I think Tiffany & Co. is a really cool brand and a really good example of using personas. So when we started working with Tiffany & Company, I think it was probably around 3 years ago, they weren't doing much in the way of customer segmentation at all. I think it was pretty basic. It was like whether you spent above or below a certain threshold, and maybe based on demographics of like male, female. So they wanted to gain a bit more insight into their customer base and figure out what their personas were. So they're now, and obviously I can't discuss what their personas are, but they're now using the 5 personas that Custora created, which are all based upon what we think that these customers are most likely to purchase. They're now using them in their emails. So they create a monthly incremental email that's differentiated based on persona. They also, we have another model that's similar to personas that we call an affinity model. It's just a lot more granular than personas. So instead of having a group of 5 distinct personas, you have, you can have, how many would you say, Andy? Like as many affinities as possible, like an affinity for a specific SKU.
I would say the affinity model is more oriented around targeting, like a customer will buy this specific thing as opposed to show me the patterns in the data.
So they use that as well for clienteling and for their catalog, determining who they think it's worth sending a catalog to, because as we all know, sending direct mail is quite expensive. So they want to make sure the right customers. So for example, those who are predicted to be high value customers are receiving that catalog. And our other customers use personas in a very similar way. It's generally either through the email channel or through display or direct mail or clienteling to determine who should receive certain marketing messages and offers. The next question that I want to get into as well, I know we talked about this, but I think it'd be helpful for people to get an even more step-by-step process of like, how exactly do you go about building the personas? And as we mentioned, like there's no right or wrong way, but maybe more about exactly how Custora does it? Like when we get a customer's data, then what happens?
Yeah, sure. So I guess I will go slightly, but not too much, onto the mathy side of things. So
The people want the math.
That's from
Like a
there.
rallying cry. So I described personas earlier as kind of like a weighted spin, right? And what we do is like we assume that a certain number of like the data, the observed order item data is described by a certain number of personas. And in the first step, actually fitting the model, what we do is we take the data and figure out both the different weighted spins, and what we do is we try to figure out the 5 weighted spins that say like best explain variation in the data. So not 5 sort of like different spinners that best describe the order patterns we see in the data, and also like weights between those 5 spins. So if you imagine kind of like a meta spinner that spins between those spinners, and that sort of meta spinner sort of sets our initial probabilities. Like, a customer has ordered nothing at all. Like, on day 0, what do we think their persona is? And the answer is kind of like a weighted average between like which personas tend to be more versus less common. But as each customer places orders, we revise our opinions of like what persona they might belong into. This is the sort of like prior posterior thing that comes up in Bayesian analysis. So we fit the model, so we get a set of personas and weights. And then what we do is we predict. So given a set of fitted parameters, we are then able to generate predictions by taking each user's observed order history, starting with those kind of prior weights that the model produced, and then revising those weights in the face of each individual's order history. And those revised weights are that set of 5 probabilities that I discussed earlier. So let's say like we start with let's say for simplicity, let's say that we have like a 3 persona model, and the weights are say like 50, 30, and 20. At the start, before you know anything about a customer, we'll believe that they're 50% persona 1, 30% persona 2, 20% persona 3. But as we observe orders, what we'll do is revise those weights. So if we start seeing a lot of purchases in order items that are specifically popular with persona number 3, what you'll see is that weight will start to creep upwards until maybe like, after a couple orders, it's more like 30, 30, 40. And then if tons of orders have been placed, then there's a strong indication that they belong to, the buying pattern described in persona 3, it could get, quite high, like, 5, 5, 9, 90 or something like that. So that's how Custora does order item persona modeling.
Andy, could you talk a little bit about, so if people are researching this at home, can you talk a little bit about like the names of the models used or the methodologies?
Yeah, I think it appeared briefly on one of the slides.
Love the name.
Yeah, Dirichlet multinomial is the name of the model that we use. What you can think of is like the observed order items, kind of like a multinomial distribution, and like the probabilities is following Dirichlet. It's kind of analogous to, those are kind of like less common, the multivariate versions. People who have done single variate versions might have come across beta binomial. It's a little more commonly seen. Dirichlet multinomial is just the multivariate extension of that. So.
Yeah, and if folks want to know how to spell that, they can email Andy at Custora.com.
It's on a slide. I think it's in like an asterisk footnote on one of the slides.
Yeah. So we have another question came in. Can you talk a little bit about the evaluation methodologies you use to validate your persona and affinity models?
Yeah, it's interesting. Like this touches a little bit on the supervised versus unsupervised point I discussed earlier. With supervised models, it's more concrete, where you say like, okay, like you predicted CLV of this, and we held out some data, so maybe we fit it on data only up through as of a year ago, and then we saw how it did on subsequent year, and the actual number was this. And aggregating those error metrics over all customers, you can get some sense of like how well the model's doing. And that there's still room for interpretation in that, different people care about different error metrics. Like, mean squared error is a very common error metric, but maybe some people care about some different things, like, oh, if it's like, if it's off by more than this amount, then like it's completely worthless or something like that. So that's the sort of supervised approach to validating models. Unsupervised models, it's definitely more artful, I guess, in terms of validating, because again, the point is to like identify patterns in the data. From a starting point of, I'm not really sure what patterns there are that you might find. I would say that, within the starting from the assumptions that starting from the model assumptions, you can say like this fit is better than this fit, because you can be like, under the model assumptions, this explains more variation in the data than this other one. But I think a lot more when trying to evaluate whether the model as a whole is doing a good job, a lot of it does come again down to sort of people looking at the data and seeing this makes sense. Like you can measure like how much of the variance is explained in the order items from this model, but a lot of it is also just like, these personas make sense. I can clearly see that yes, when I look at users who are assigned to this persona, they're clearly exhibiting these patterns that are clearly different from users assigned to this other persona. And if you're generating those distinctions one way or another, then the model is sort of generating separation between the personas, which is all you can really ask it to do. You're asking it to explain variation in the data. So yeah, I'd say that that's for the unsupervised approaches. It's more that seeing whether you are just creating personas that are clearly distinct from each other and different.
Cool. When would you recommend using software like Custora versus using a market research or consulting firm to help you uncover your personas? And this is for JC too, who did this in the past at McKinsey.
Sure. Well, I think that I can speak to a few. It comes down to, again, what you're trying to do with the data and the output of the data. Building a data-driven, order history-driven set of personas, like what Andy is describing, is operationally is very complex, and putting that into practice in the wild is even more complex. So I think if you're looking for a one-time, I think where consulting firms are doing it yourself are useful is when you're trying to create kind of order out of chaos, and you're trying to create some sort of one-time view of the way your customers look. I think what's very hard after you do that without software, frankly, like Custora, even though this isn't really an advertisement for Custora, but what's hard is when you have to actually get it updated and get your data flowing in, and store new customers, and create treatments for the channel managers to be able to actually put that stuff into practice. Those types of things are very hard with, frankly, a person sitting in a room with Enterprise Miner, right? And so software like Custora can help not only with the initial creation of those things, but also actually creating impact for them in an ongoing basis in the future.
Yeah, and I guess I'll just tack on a bit to that and just saying that very much Custora, we're what's the difference between Custora and say consultancy? It's that we're software, we're an app, we're automated, we're sort of very technical, and consequently we're perhaps less bespoke. If you have a very narrowly specific project that you want to do that's very specific to the kinds of things that you need, and you don't it's maybe the kind of situation where a consultancy or special work would be more called for. Custora's mindset is much more here's a platform, here are if you give us our data, we'll provide all these systematic insights, we'll do it automatically. Our objective is to be able to do it for all sorts of different customers in this kind of scalable, automated way. And the insights will give you, we'll give you some curation and some guides as to how to, what you can do with it. But we'd also like you to see these insights and feel empowered to do your own thing with them. Like, you know, it's cool when our customers use our product for, you know, things we've planned. But what's much cooler, in my opinion, is when customers use our product for things that we haven't planned for, where they're like, oh, like here's this great insight. Oh, I've got this great business use case for my business based on this, and I'll take what you've given me and then, you know, do something for my company with that. That's the coolest part, in my opinion, when I guess emergent uses arise.
That leads into the next question, which is a question I like a lot, and I think one that we've been thinking about a ton at Custora, which is, how do you make personas feel relevant and usable to different teams in the company? Because we talked a lot about marketing, but I think one of our goals is for these personas to be useful to other teams, not just marketing.
I can take a step. I can take
Yeah.
an initial step at it. I think, well, again, going back to like some of the use cases we mentioned earlier, I think merch is like a really interesting consumer of persona-based data. I think merch is in an interesting position where they're both trying to kind of like differentiate the brand by creating new exciting products, but also, you know, cater to the the company's wheelhouse and the company's like core customer, while trying to keep everything fresh at the same time. So I think a combination of both like taste and these frankly gut feel personas, plus a data-driven approach to understanding the kind of the core buyer, is interesting and is an application that we've seen customers start to use personas for. I think from there's like a below, so marketing is like, there's like the kind of the direct marketing side of things, but also like the brand marketing side of things that uses, you know, they're not doing pure targeted like email specific or address specific targeting, but being able to speak to those personas with messaging that resonates is another big thing.
I'll again maybe just add on, you know, all I have to say beyond that is that, like, okay, we have, you know, our personas are oriented around what people order, but we do have, you know, we do let people like specify like different attributes of orders, and if they supply them to us, we can create personas on them. So again, you know, the question of like make personas relevant, I think touches on the thing I mentioned at the start, which is that, you know, you can kind of draw a distinction between the data you fit personas to and the actual mechanics of like fitting a persona. And the question of like, you know, how to keep persona analysis or really any data analysis relevant, a lot of it depends on like, you know, what data you're feeding it. Like, you know, what are you building personas atop? You know, what will interest, you know, what data the personas are built atop of, I think determines what will be of interest to different teams at a company.
Yep. Sorry, I can add one more. I got one more. VM is another interesting area of the business that can use personas. So oftentimes the decision to place things like a belt with a pair of jeans can be based on like a designer specifying that or two things that go well together. Personas can help you uncover like potentially areas of connection between products that you might not necessarily know existed, and you can therefore then merchandise in store from a visual perspective around those clusters, which is another area that we've seen.
Awesome. So I think we have time for one more question, and this is a good one. The example you gave is very retail focused. How do you build personas in a world where you're only selling one single product? What data would you use, and how does that fit into the concept of a spin?
Okay, so yeah.
Okay, Andy's thought about it.
Yeah, no, so when we talk about like, say, like a model like the Dirichlet multinomial, where it's sort of like, you know, got this concept of a spin, that relates to what I said earlier about how, like, you know, your choice of data and your choice of model are, you know, two distinct things, but not entirely unrelated. So for example, the models we use are really oriented around count data because that is what we've sort of chosen to model on. Like, you know, counting different, you know, different categories of order items and, saying like, okay, like this user tends to order of, things of this type or tends to order things of that type. Now I'm using the term order here, but in a broader sense, in industries outside of retail, you could call it not an order, but an event. And if you have data about events, whether or not they're orders or some other kind of seller-customer interaction, and you have attributes on them, you could also use this similar approach, so long as you have count data and different attributes, to build personas atop that data. Now, if you are dealing with data that is not count-oriented, you would probably not use a Dirichlet multinomial at all, because the model is kind of oriented around like clustering users based on like counts. So you'd probably use a different kind of clustering approach. I mean, there are a couple like common and simple ones out there, like k-means is maybe the most well-known and most broadly available in many statistical packages. I'm sure there are other more complicated ones that are specific to different industries and applications. But yeah, I mean, that's how it is. Like the models we use are oriented around count data. They're not necessarily focused on retail. In fact, the model, I believe, originally came out of a biology paper, actually counting, I think like counting cells or something in petri dishes.
It's true, because I Googled it after you told me that, and everything that comes up is biology related.
Yeah, biology related. I mean, a lot of statistics does actually come, statistical research does come from biology a good deal. So it's not, it's not necessarily retail focused, and you can do it with other events and attributes. But if you're doing non-count data, you would probably want to turn to a different model entirely.
There's also other elements. Maybe this is what you meant with attributes, but there are other elements of the events that you could model against. Maybe not. Yeah, to your point, maybe not that. Like when it happened, what channel it happened in, time of, there are probably other things. If you were only selling one product and it was like, I would first start by thinking about like, what are the treatments I want to offer to my customers? If you're talking about marketing, what are the other treatments I want to offer to my customers? Can I code attributes that would help me decide on those treatments into my event data? And then it wouldn't be the model we use, but it could be a different model. So maybe think about like other elements of the event that you could bring into your data set. Yeah,
and if you have events, like you can, some attribute that you can be creative in, for example, if you're doing time of day, you could partition the day into buckets and then, count based on what bucket events fell into.
Yeah. So, price points, although that's getting other stuff. But, yeah. Okay.
Cool. So I think one last thing, and that's just, we skipped over this takeaways slide. So if we had to sum it up into 3 things we wanted to leave with you guys. You want me to take this?
Yeah, go for it.
So overall, what do personas do? They help marketers divide their customer base into meaningful segments. And then the other thing we really wanted you guys to take away is that it's important to determine the question that you want to answer in order to decide what data and models to use. So the data and models we use are purchase behavior and the Dirichlet multinomial model, because we're trying to predict what people will purchase. Then the third thing is the number of personas you decide on should also be meaningful and actionable. So as we mentioned before, like you could divide your customer base into every single person as a different persona, but that wouldn't be very useful. So the way we do it is we keep it at 5, and that's worked well for our customers, something that marketers can action on. So with that, I think we can wrap it up.
Right.
Thank you, JC. Thank you, Andy.
Thank you, Maddie.
Thanks, everybody.
Thank you, listeners. Have a great rest of your day. Bye.